everybody. Thank you for coming. We have a tremendous program today. I'm very excited about the people we have here and the topics we're going to be discussing. My name is David Sandalow. I'm the Inaugural Fellow at the Center for Global Energy Policy here at Columbia. This is part of a regular speaker series that we are launching under the leadership of our director, Jason Bordoff. We've got a program that includes not just regular events on the energy topics of the day, but also publications and research that we hope is informing the conversation in this city, in this country, and around the world. We have two upcoming events. On March 30, we have a discussion on Iran nuclear negotiations, featuring our fellow Richard Nephew, who just left the National Security Council staff and is now a fellow at our Center on Global Energy Policy, along with Gary Sick, a longtime distinguished Columbia professor, and Gary Seymour, who is also on the NSC staff. And that's March 30th at 6 p.m., if anybody's interested. And then on April 2nd, we have a discussion on fossil fuel subsidies. I think the subtitle is something to the effect of, if they don't serve any purpose, why are they so popular? And that features our non-resident fellow, Joe Aldi, our fellow Keith Benish, who I think is here, and Columbia professor Johannes Erpalainen. But today our topic is clean energy finance. And the world is on a transition to a clean energy economy. The pace is uncertain, but the direction is clear. And over the course of the next several decades, according to the International Energy Agency, in order to achieve the climate goals that it has been agreed internationally, in order to limit warming to 3.6 degrees Fahrenheit or 2 degrees centigrade, the world is going to need to mobilize, according to the IEA, an additional $4 to $5 trillion of capital above the baseline investments that will already be invested. And a big question is how that's going to happen. And that, broadly speaking, is the topic of our discussion today. We are incredibly fortunate to have as our lead speaker Bill Janeway, who doesn't need much of an introduction, is very well known in this area, but let me say is I can't think of anybody who has combined more success both in the practitioner and as a practitioner and as a theoretician as Bill Janeway. Bill is a leading venture capitalist for more than 40 years. That's to date you, Bill, but I think that's correct. He is well known for heading up the information technology section or part of Warburg Pincus and building up that practice extremely successfully. He is also a theoretician affiliated with Cambridge, author of a tremendous book called Doing Capitalism, which I highly recommend. He's overcome the handicap of a Princeton degree and gone on to a very successful career. He was actually the valedictorian at Princeton a few years ago, and has written a great foreign affairs article on the topics we're about to discuss today, which I recommend to you. So we'll start with comments by Bill Janeway.
Well, of course, with that introduction, it's all downhill from here. I should say that the class of which I had the honor to be valedictorian was the class of 1965, which you know is Bill Bradley's class. And I won't recall for you the scores of Princeton basketball and Princeton football against Columbia those years, but the spread was perhaps the largest in the history of Ivy League sports. But my mother and my wife are Columbia graduates and deeply dedicated. So I want to be concise. I want to make 5 points. I want to make 5 points about financing innovation at the frontier of scientific knowledge and technological capabilities. First of all, the first point is that historically, advances at the frontier have depended on sources of capital decoupled from immediate concern with economic value and financial return, and most particularly certainly since World War II, have turned on sponsorship across multiple dimensions by an economically active and politically legitimate state. So the search for a national mission, the establishment of a national mission, is the first prerequisite. Back in the 19th century, it was actually the French and the Germans whose national mission was economic development to catch up with Britain that led to the first state investments in science. In the Pasteur Institute, the William II Institute, which became the existing structure of German research. And for the US, of course, beginning in 1940-41 with the creation of the Office of Scientific Research and Development led by the great Vannevar Bush, it was national security. Renewed from 1950, the onset of the Korean War, in the form of the Defense Department's aggressive sponsorship from funding fundamental science to being the lead customer, the lead collaborative customer for all of the technologies from silicon to software that emerged as information and communications technology, the digital revolution. Now, the first effort to define a national mission that would legitimize state programs in support of alternative energy came with the Carter administration at the end of the 1970s, and the mission, the proposed mission, was energy independence. I will not forget that as a then relatively young man, I was a junior member of an informal group that aggressively lobbied Jim Schlesinger, who was extremely disappointed at having been passed over for Secretary of Defense when Harold Brown was elevated from the presidency of Caltech, having been Secretary of the Air Force. And we set out to convince Schlesinger that as the first secretary of the newly created Department of Energy, he would have greater leverage over the strategic future of the United States than as Secretary of Defense. And boy, were we wrong. The energy independence as a national mission failed. And the programs of the Carter administration that ranged across an array of subsidies and priorities and regulatory incentives, with the sole exception of mileage requirements for automobiles, were effectively rolled back by the Reagan administration. And the rollback reflects a fundamental difference, this is my second point, between the environment in which the Defense Department, and from 1958 on, DARPA as the lead agency, drove the accelerated development and deployment of information technology. This factor radically distinguishes alternative energy and its position from that of IT, and that is the exposure to commodity markets. It was the collapse of oil prices, not just market fundamentalism, that made it easy to repudiate the energy independence as a national mission and national goal 35 years ago. Today, obviously, we're living with another exercise in experiencing the exposure to commodity markets. And the timelines and the return calculations that are tied to major commitments, both to big infrastructure on the one hand, but also to scientific research pushing the kinds of technologies, battery technology. These are very long-lived projects. If you're going to put them against if you're going to deploy the neoclassical production mechanism and measure prospective return based on the net present value of expected future cash flows, you are radically exposed. So national mission is the vehicle for protecting the investments, the upstream investments in research, the midstream investments in deployment at scale for these new energy technologies. Now, I should pause for a moment, and I know that the commentator, that Kristina in particular, will be able to talk about this, but one simple measure of the lingering magnitude, quantifiable, of the national mission of national security versus today I'm afraid, in this country at least, still stuttering, haphazard, incomplete attempt to define a second national mission for energy in response to climate change is a simple quantitative measure. DARPA's budget today still runs order of magnitude $3 billion a year. ARPA-E's budget request is $300 million, a tenth. For technologies and deployment challenges, I think we would agree at least as great. Now, third, one of the lessons from the DARPA's sponsorship of the IT revolution was the need to devise strategies and practical programs for attacking, undermining, evading, going around the big established incumbents. In the 1970s and 80s, there were two: IBM, AT&T. DARPA's greatest triumph in IT was to construct a community of interested, self-interested, driven, visionary technologists, entrepreneurs, and venture capitalists who collectively sideswiped IBM, which owned computing, through the centralized mainframe, highly inflexible architecture that was absolutely dominant. And DARPA sponsored what we came to know as client-server computing, distributed computing. Great article by Bonvillian and Bonata that compares the history of DARPA with the position of ARPA-E as of about 2 years ago that goes into great detail on this. I won't attempt to replicate it. Similarly, DARPA had another challenge in the digital revolution, and that was over communications technology. As I'm sure you're all aware, the internet began as the answer to a challenge. How do we communicate? This is Defense Department challenge. How do we communicate in the context of thermonuclear war when the circuits that AT&T has built and managed are blown up? And the answer was packet switching technology, extremely novel. AT&T fought it from the scientific workshops to the White House for 20 years, but DARPA was able again to construct constituencies of scientists, of entrepreneurs, with political oversight from the top that enabled that to happen. Now, IBM and AT&T were both very rich and very entrenched in the 1970s. Neither of them were as rich as ExxonMobil. So the challenge today of constructing a community of interest that, with the top cover of a national mission itself, certainly not yet accepted, although it may be defined, represents a double challenge for alternative energy. Now, the second measure, one simple measure, DARPA versus ARPA-E in terms of their budget, a second quantifiable measure is the magnitude and the investment success of venture-backed entrepreneurial startups. Obviously, beginning in the roughly 1980 to 85 period, the volume of funding, but above all, the magnitude of the success of the companies from Sun Microsystems to Cisco to my own BEA Systems that enabled first client-server computing and then the internet as a platform and environment for every imaginable kind of computing application. That was an enormous feedback loop into the political clout of the sponsors in Washington. This time around, a subset of my venture capital friends set about in the mid-2000s trying to accelerate the world into a clean tech bubble and failed across the boards. Variety of reasons for the failure. I would say first, DARPA and DoD had pulled all of the enabling technologies from silicon to software down the learning curve, close enough to the commercial frontier that a startup could come out of Stanford like Sun and Silicon Graphics or Cisco, and in 3 to 5 years be generating revenues from products that were working and running. Clean tech in one domain was subject to massive dollars. This was the kind of extraordinary silliness of investing in ethanol plants, venture guys investing in ethanol plants, where a unit is $1 billion, and to be up and running is multiple units. So the scale was wrong, and the exposure to the commodity markets was at the most extreme, as well as to regulatory change. And on the other hand, the advanced technologies are simply take longer. Venture guys are no good at funding science. They have a 3 to 5 year horizon to demonstrate that they have something they're going to be able to give back to their limited partners in another 3 years. It was a category error for the venture world to address clean tech. Now, having done my best to depress you, there is, however, a useful counterexample, and it's one that emerged and evolved almost by stealth. And of course, it's fracking, the history of fracking. The guys at the Breakthrough Institute have done a kind of definitive, as advocates of how state investments, government investments, can create a platform on which an entrepreneur can dance, which is exactly what I think DoD did for all of us in the IT industry over the last generation. Fracking, the technologies that came together as fracking, all of them evolved out of state government subsidized or directly government funded research projects that ranged across from the Eastern Gas Shales Project, the Gas Research Institute's support from FERC, the exercise in doing microseismic imaging to understand what was going on in underground nuclear tests, horizontal drilling funded by IRDA and the Bureau of Mines. This began in the early 70s. It took 20 years for an extraordinary entrepreneur named George Mitchell to drill a horizontal well in the Barnett Shale of eastern Texas and blow out, crack the shale and get oil coming out. It took another 10 years for it to be commercially, for the return on investment to be positive. 40 years from the first R&D to where it makes, at scale, an enormous difference to the energy economy. Clearly, that story, I don't mean to say that fracking solves the problem of alternative energy. Not at all. I don't mean to suggest that at all. I meant to suggest the timeline, the somewhat stealthy case-by-case support for a set of technologies which actually were not being orchestrated by anyone except a kind of informal band of people who talk to each other. And then an entrepreneur taking advantage of it, doing a proof of concept, and over the next 20 years, it becoming economically meaningful. By the way, this history defines exactly why I say alternative energy is a category error for venture capitalists. I don't mean this in every specific instance, but more generally and more broadly. So I think I've done my 20 minutes, David. I hope I've provided some provocative points for response, rebuttal, and discussion. Thank you.
I'm not sure your final point lifted me out of the depression from your first few points. Let me just ask you a few questions and then introduce Kristina and Sarah. And I'm going to try to be more optimistic, and you can tell me whether this is justified or not. So just to pick a few areas that are maybe going well right now in this area, and is interested in your reaction. I mean, one of them is solar. And we've seen, enormous price drops in solar, 85% roughly in the past 6 or 7 years. We're seeing rapid deployment. How do you explain that, progress, and is there anything we can learn from what's happening in solar for other parts of the clean tech area?
No, clearly solar is a success. And Doyne Farmer at the INET Institute at Oxford has been doing a kind of Wright's law analysis of price as a function of not time, not like Moore's law, but of actual cumulative production. And it's doing a very nice job of tracking silicon, that is semiconductor technology, in terms of that. The issues around integrating solar into a grid with reliable, scalable grid scale storage is obviously one of ARPA-E's, it's one of their challenges. It's one that I think could take DARPA-style funding, not ARPA-E-style funding, to accelerate. Battery technology, we look at all of the metrics around semiconductor performance, storage, communications bandwidth, and they all look like this and like this. And you look at battery, energy density per unit of weight in a battery, and it goes sort of like this. You can maybe see an improvement on a decade-long basis. So I think that there are, well, I guess I would put it this way. The great historian of electrification, Tom Hughes, said that the electrification proceeded by way of reverse salience opening up as advances in one part of this broad front of necessary technological innovation produced a blocking point that had to be addressed, had to be attacked. And that's where I think we probably are with grid storage today. Because we have, in some places, people think too much wind. That's because they probably live near it. We have a lot of solar, but integrating that into an intelligent grid system, there now is a blocking point. But it's also, I think, the scale of funds committed to deployment at scale, as well as the upstream research, requires, let's say, a broader acceptance that this is a national mission.
Do you have any thoughts on some of the financial innovation that's happening in this sector? A lot of people in this space are excited about green bonds, and they've grown a fair amount in the past year. Green bonds defined as an issuer saying that they're going to use their funds for green purposes, but standing behind it. It's not project-based lending. It's the issuer stands behind it. And the World Bank is certainly increasing, and then lots of private banks. Do you think that's a promising development?
Sure. Socially relevant bonds, there's a lot of this in Australia, or there was at least before Tony Abbott. And I do think that a very, very low interest rate environment is a wonderful opportunity for experimentation and new instruments that might offer a couple of 100 basis points above 10-year treasuries. So this is a good environment for it. It might be a little more challenging if rates renormalize.
Okay, then just one more question, and we'll go to the speakers. Stepping back, big picture, do you have any recommendations, given all these challenges, for if you want to mobilize capital in this space, any couple of things that you would recommend people do in order to accomplish that objective?
Well, I think that working how to help create communities of interest, particularly with that set, maybe, I don't know how, I think my colleagues on the panel know more about how large the subset is, of incumbents who get it, that sooner or later they're going to be on not just the wrong side of history, but the wrong side of the balance sheet, the wrong side of the P&L, the wrong side of their bonuses, and who are prepared to partner. Because when you have, Schumpeter had two models for how innovation takes place. Model one, it's all entrepreneurs, it's all startups. Model two, after he had become at least my age, innovation has been reduced to a bureaucratic routine. It's all big established companies. What we're seeing now in the world of IT is a great, and in biotech, is a kind of Schumpeter Mark III. Innovation by early stage companies that are then commercialized and supported by established companies that have balance sheets, channels to the marketplace, sometimes, often by acquisition, often by partnership. I would be looking for relevant partnerships with established companies that get it and that have access to capital that I don't have.
Great. All right, we'll come back to this. So maybe, Kristina, I'll just introduce you from here, and you could go up there to talk. So I don't know, we work together closely in the Department of Energy, Dr. Johnson and I. I don't know anybody who combines top-level academic success, top-level service in government, and business success as much as Dr. Kristina Johnson. She, an electrical engineer, she was the provost at Johns Hopkins, have I got that right? And the dean at of engineering at Duke, a very distinguished academic career. She was then Undersecretary of Energy, managing a budget of about $4 billion at the U.S. Department of Energy, and is now a clean tech entrepreneur, which I trust you're going to tell us about. So we really thank you very much for coming to Columbia, and delighted to have you.
Thank you very much, David. It's a pleasure to be here. So I agree with an awful lot of what you said, Bill, and but I'll still be provocative, if that's
Good.
okay. So the first thing I think I would ask when I thought about the title, David, is transition to a low-carbon future. Now, can it be done? First of all, is it technically feasible? And I don't know if you remember when we went to COP15. It was December 9th, 2010, right? So there was this op-ed in the Wall Street Journal that came out by a professor at MIT that said it can't be done. Just physically, we would not be able to get to a low-carbon future. So we came back from Copenhagen, and we set about to figure out, I'm an engineer, is there a way to get from almost 6 gigatons of carbon emissions in 2010 out to less than 2 gigatons in 2050? And what would be the midpoints? So I'm going to cut to the chase, but if you want to read the rest of it, you can. It's called the Strategic Technology Energy Plan. And we found that we could do it, and actually there's a good story and there's some challenges because we've at least had 5 years of history. So let me jump to the conclusion a little bit. If you wanted to reach 80% clean electricity by 2035, which after we submitted the plan to the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, John Holdren's, there we are in January 2011 watching the State of the Union address, and all of a sudden the president announces, we can get to 80% clean electricity by 2035. I nearly fell off my chair. I thought, ooh, now I've done it. Okay, so we have to get after it. So I left because we always talked about, can we bring capital off the sidelines to invest in the clean energy future? And what most people don't realize is that our biggest renewable in the U.S. is hydropower. And certainly it's getting a run at it, which is good, from wind and solar, but largest is hydropower. So I started a company to build at existing dams. We don't build new dams, but if there's going to be a dam for navigation, recreation, irrigation, or navigation, you might as well get power out of it. And so that's what we have been after. And I would agree with you, you've got to partner. And we partnered with a private equity firm here in New York. And we started out being called Enduring Hydro. We had a bunch of private equity firms we were talking to, and we all had code names for them. And the one we went with is I Squared Capital. We codenamed them Cube, so now our joint venture is called Cube Hydro. But I digress. So let me go back to how do we get to 80% clean electricity by 2035 technically? Roughly one path with no breakthroughs in any technologies, including battery, would be a third renewables, a third nuclear, and a third fossil fuel, which half of that would have to have carbon capture and sequestration. So you can kind of remember that it's a third, a third, a third. So let's look at renewables. At the time, we were about 10% renewable. Most of that was from hydropower. Today, we're up towards 20%. And a lot of that growth, we've had a 7-fold increase in solar. We've had about a 70% increase in wind. We've had a negative 0.2% decrease in hydro, but I'm doing my best. So we'll see how we can go there. But I think that the renewables are well on its way. And here's what STEP, the Strategic Technology Energy Plan, calls for. You have to install 5,400 megawatts per year of solar every year from now until 2035. Well, in 2010, we had less than 2 gigawatts installed. But actually, we've been at a clip of greater than 6,000 per year, and we're well on our way to achieve that. So I think you can check the box on solar. With wind, you'd have to do 6,000 megawatts per year. And now here's the problem, and I would argue that it's maybe not so much access to the commodity markets. I totally agree that energy is not a venture play, and you nailed it. You exactly nailed it. But what you do need is you've got to be able to finance it. You've got to be able to have solid policy. Solar with the 1603 cashback grant in lieu of tax credit runs till 2016. So you have some enormously clever financing that was done by the Solar City Sunrun Sungevities. Wind goes up and down like this because the production tax credits were set to expire in 2012. And then they'd get renewed at the end of 2013 and then again at the end of 2014. Well, if you get it renewed like it was this last year in December, you can't put any money to work, you can't build anything, you can't finance, you can't start the project. So there's no, it's no big secret why wind has struggled a little bit. And hydro, that has a lot to do with licensing, and that's a separate story which I won't bore you with. But frankly, I think renewables is a pretty bright story. Well, we've got a little bit of a challenges in nuclear, and Fukushima didn't help. We're about 20% of our electricity from nuclear. Turns out what we'd have to do is build 60 new Generation 3 plus power plants between now and about 2050. That's not so bad, because if you think of how many we built in this country in 1973, we built 13 a year. That's about 5 to 6 a year between 2025 and over that period of time. You'd more than achieve that. So I think if nuclear could get started again, which requires us really being serious about managing the back end of the fuel cycle, which Secretary Chu and myself tripled the amount of research dollars to do that. We probably need, as you were saying, at least an order of magnitude more funding to do that. So nuclear, I think the jury's out. We are building the first two new nuclear power plants in this country in 30 years with Vogtle 1 and 2 in Georgia. A lot of that happened because of state regulations. You can put it into your rate base so the citizens are paying for it, and that's the way that's happening. So in addition to building 60 new power plants, we'd have to extend the life of all 104 reactors of the 65 plants to 60 years, and half of them to 80 years. And again, that depends on how the vessel reactors, the condition in there, and we've had some issues with that. So I think nuclear is sort of on the bubble, so to speak. Fossil is where we really have trouble. And I think the problem with that is right now we've got in coal 601 plants that generate about 310 gigawatts, and in natural gas we have about 1,600 plants that generate about 200 gigawatts. The STEP plan calls for reducing that combined power from 520 gigawatts down to about 430 gigawatts. Half in natural gas, half in coal with carbon capture and sequestration. And I agree with you on your assessment of fracking. I think the challenge is that we may make some decisions in the near term that get rid of the coal, but then lock us into a particular fuel supply that don't allow us to hit our carbon emissions. And if you look at what's happened in the last 5 years, we've only marginally decreased our carbon emissions. So my view is that the real constraint that we have is time. And that's and now we have 5 less years than when we first were after this. So I think that it's technically feasible. How much would it cost? Before we talk about how we get it financed, what would it cost? So in order to get to 80% clean electricity by 2035, it's $1 trillion of incremental increase of funding. So how much is $1 trillion? It sounds like a lot, and it is. Over the 25 years, it's $40 billion a year, and that's one non-fat venti latte a week per household, or 3 Dunkin' Donuts coffees at $1.69. So it is doable. In fact, if you look at it, it's less a percentage of our gross domestic product than we spent on the interstate highway system. We spent $450 billion from 1956 to 1980, and it was 0.43% of our gross domestic product. We'd only have to spend 0.37% to implement STEP and actually achieve this low carbon future. So it requires a similar investment of what we did in the 50s. And so I will end this by just saying that, 1, it's doable. 2, it's less than we've done before. But the motivator, and again, not to sound boring, but I agree with you again, Bill. Why did we build the infrastructure in the U.S. in the 50s? So if you look at it, and I read your article before today, which I thought was very good in Foreign Affairs, the 19th century was all about our manifest destiny, Bill, in your article. The 20th century at the beginning, I think, was all about coming out as a major force. The last end of the 20th century, I think, was about healthcare, environment, quality of life, hopefully getting to the environment. What's the 21st century going to be about? And I think it's got to be about sustainability. So if we think about sustainability, China is spending $75 billion a year, every year till 2020. The UK is spending 1% of their gross domestic product. We only have to spend 0.37%. We can do this. And I guess I would conclude by saying the problem with it is very similar to the problem that a president or provost has running a university. And that is you have to take some money from departments that are doing really well and invest in departments that aren't quite commercial, if you will, and that's the problem. And I think one of the other problems is 695 presidents of American colleges and universities have signed the climate commitment, 695. But how many of them actually put a budget behind it? How many are actually following through on that commitment? And that's where we don't have the accountability. So I just would say that our parents and grandparents after World War II left us with a great legacy, a way to get from one place to another. I think we have to leave our children and grandchildren a similar legacy, clean air and clean water.
That was great, Kristina, and thank you for the optimism, which I really appreciate. And maybe I should try to pierce the optimism just to play the devil's advocate in both areas. Let me just ask about scaling up in the way you were talking about. So I understand the scaling, and just drill down on a few particular points. Scaling up solar, I understand. Can we scale up wind in the way that those sounded like very big numbers, and we've got that sounds like it involves lots of transmission that would be difficult to cite, that type of thing. But
right. So good question. Well, I do have view graphs that show that we've actually been deploying over the what was it, 6,000? Did I say 6,000? I wrote it down to make sure I knew. Yeah, 6,000 megawatts per year when we've aligned policy with what the intended outcomes are. I think we can get more efficiency. I think that what we're seeing is, of course, the taller the turbine base, the pole, if you will, the access to more wind and more resource. So you're going to see a renovation of the technology. I do believe wind, absolutely, solar for sure, but we need a policy. And I think what we need is access to low-cost capital. And we need to have vision. We need to have, our little power plants will run for 80 years. We just bought a plant that was built in 1924, and we plan to run it for another 40 or 50 years. So what's wrong with, double-digit returns every year for 40 years? I mean, low double digits, but double-digit returns. I mean, I think that's a wonderful thing.
Well, and your point on vision is exactly aligned with what Bill's saying on the national mission. Absolutely. So let me ask you then about your experience raising capital in the private sector then, because you've gone out and you've done this successfully, and any lessons to be learned from that? And there's, a lot of companies have struggled in this market, to say the least, and I'm sure it wasn't easy, but how'd you manage to do it?
So I think part of it is that after you go to a bunch of investors and you tell them, gee, wouldn't it be great to clean the grid? And they say, yeah, gee, wouldn't it be great to get these kind of returns? And after you've heard that about 10 times, then you realize, okay, we got to be clever and we got to do both. We've got to focus on getting the returns to the investors in an area where we can clean the grid. And it was just being clever about how to do that and focusing on, marketing 101. You got to give people what they want to buy or else they're not going to buy it. So I think that as soon as I didn't lead with the climate change and clean energy, but led with the stability and the returns, then, we had a lot of activity.
All right, one more question. It's more on the technical side. I'm curious on hydro and the potential there. So you're not building new dams, and we're not, but you're replacing older turbines. Is that, and with turbines that are more efficient, and then what is, just from a national standpoint, what's the potential? I think you touched on this, but what's the potential from doing that? Because that sounds like a relatively non-intrusive way to generate more power. How much could we do by doing that?
So there's 80,000 dams in the U.S. and only 2,500 produce electricity. So enormous opportunity. And then of the ones that are producing electricity, So I'm glad you asked that question. Half are owned roughly by the federal government and the other half by private sector. I think it would be fantastic if we could figure out a way to bring private capital to upgrade and modernize. For example, the Army Corps has 20,000 megawatts. If we could upgrade and modernize those plants, we could green the entire Department of Defense electrical consumption. And if we powered just 100 of the top 100 dams, 700 of which are owned by the Army Corps, we could power the entire U.S. government electrical consumption.
And you can do that without affecting biological values or
Yeah, absolutely.
fish and that.
Yep.
Very interesting. All right. So we thought we would, for a final speaker, focus on the specific and the practical, and also get local, because on this topic of clean energy finance, there's no state agency that's doing more and more creative action in the country than right here in New York. Sarah Davidson is an associate at the New York Green Bank, where she provides investment portfolio management and other types of support. Before that, she was a special assistant to the energy czar of the state of New York, Richard Kaufman, who has a fancier title, but that's what he really is. He's the energy czar. And she worked for the Coalition for Green Capital in Washington, D.C. before that, and is a graduate of Colorado College, and we are thrilled to have her.
Thank you very much. So, is this on?
I think it is.
Okay. Can you guys hear me? Great. So thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to be a part of this panel. I'm here to tell you a little bit about New York Green Bank, but also I think I'm probably going to be the most optimistic one on this panel. Maybe it's because I left D.C. a few years ago and have been in New York where there's a lot happening. So I'm an associate at New York Green Bank. We're a $1 billion state-sponsored specialty finance entity. We're really here to work with the private sector to get them more involved in New York's clean energy transactions. I actually think it'd be useful to maybe talk a little bit about what's happening kind of on the New York energy landscape more broadly before I kind of dive into what we're doing. We're one piece really of kind of a lot that's going on right now, including, some of you might be familiar with this, the Reforming the Energy Vision proceeding, which is being run by the Department of Public Service. It's New York's comprehensive strategy to really create an efficient, resilient, and affordable clean energy system. So kind of everything that you've been saying in terms of building these communities of interest and having a national vision. I think in New York there is definitely this vision that everybody's working towards, and post-Sandy, Irene, and a lot of the other storms that happened, the governor really has launched a very comprehensive effort to try to update our energy system. And there's an enormous amount of capital that's going to be required in order to accomplish that. So that's really where we come in. We work with the private sector. We don't just involve in one-off projects. We're really about driving scale in any transaction that we do. So yeah, again, in New York alone, we did a study with Booz & Co. a few years ago, and they estimated that the potential for New York-based clean energy projects alone is about an $85 billion market. And right now, commercial investors are really only investing in a small slice of that. And that's for a variety of reasons. But so we're here really to work with them. They come to us, tell us what kind of projects they want to be doing really more of, spaces that they're either already active in or want to be active in, and we help them kind of expand to the next frontier. So we always operate on the near frontier of where these commercial players are already operating. So some of the reasons why there aren't more projects being done is really just kind of a new space. A lot of these financial institutions are really familiar with utility scale projects, and to some degree, I guess, residential solar, thanks to the solar cities of the world. But these are small transactions, generally distributed generation and energy efficiency projects. There's just a lack of industry and product coverage clarity. A lot of times due to regulatory issues, there's issues around tenor and kind of how long these banks and institutional capital providers can provide their loans for. So again, we operate in a very different way than the state has before. We're not developing programs and saying, if you want to buy into it, we're going to, set this up for you. We really have the private sector come to us. We have an open solicitation on our website, and we typically receive proposals from like developers and their banks. And let's say this is our bank that's interested in financing this project. They can't because X, Y, Z, and we'll work with them to address those issues. So any project proposals that come in, we evaluate based on 3 primary criteria, and I think this is a really important element of what we do. We need to receive our capital back, and we expect financial returns that are comparable to market expectations. So we're not subsidized capital, we're not cheap government money. We're really here to, I keep saying we're like the training wheels for clean energy deals, but that hasn't taken off yet, I don't know, I think it's pretty clever. But we're really here to get the private sector to do more of these. We want them to see what kind of returns they're going to get from making these investments, make them more comfortable with the space. Second criteria is that our investments need to result in reduced greenhouse gas emissions. That's either from energy savings through efficiency or through clean energy generated. And then the last piece speaks to this idea of scale. So, any investment we make needs to result in greater private sector capital deployed into the sector. If you're familiar with what's happening in New York, we talk a lot about market transformation, and so this last criteria really speaks to that. So I think of this as having two components. On the one hand, any transaction proposal that comes into us needs to demonstrate why we're needed in the transaction. So it's obviously creditworthy counterparties. I've got this financial backer, they're really interested in the project. I could really be driving this to scale and make this sort of widespread across the state of New York, but I'm unable to because X, Y, Z, and that's where we come in. And then that second piece is really how the private sector is going to do this on their own after our role in the transaction is done. Other considerations are we need to have at least one or more private sector financial parties involved. So if you came to us and said, I'm working with Middletown, a municipality in Middletown, New York, to do street lighting, and I got a big grant from NYSERDA or another, ESD or whatever it is, can you guys give us a loan too? Well, we couldn't because we need, Bank of America or Deutsche Bank or somebody else to be involved that's going to be a private sector capital provider. We operate in wholesale, not retail markets. Again, that's based on the idea of driving scale. We need the transaction to be economically and technically feasible, and it needs to involve sufficient client and partner skin in the game. So we don't want to be the only ones that are taking risk in any transaction. Again, that's about getting private sector more comfortable with these transactions. I might be running out of time, but basically, so we have a few products that we can offer. Sort of broad categories, but again, these are kind of evolving based on what we're seeing coming in. But credit enhancement, warehouse, and aggregation. So we'll work with an aggregator who can, pool together similar types of small projects. And then once that portfolio reaches a certain size, we would sell that to a third-party takeout. Asset loans and investments, and then composite products, basically where we can, play multiple roles in a transaction. Our pricing, again, reflect market rates, so our risk positions in a capital structure, pricing for comparable transactions, and then the commercial expectations of rates at a point when the market's more liquid, so we kind of are forward-looking when we're thinking about how we're pricing our products. Prudent steward of ratepayer funds, unlike, a lot of the traditional ways the state has tried to support the clean energy sector, we get our capital back, we can recycle that and redeploy it over time. And then again, just an agent for greater private investment, so ensuring that we're, working hand in hand with the private sector in anything that we do. And then the last piece is really that we, our products and the role that we play in the marketplace will continue to evolve as these markets evolve. So, if we're seeing a lot of solar and let's say, energy efficiency right now, in 6 months or a year, maybe we're going to be seeing a lot more storage, kind of whatever the market is interested in is where we'll go. So happy to, and we announced our first 7 transactions. We've been open for about a year, announced our first 7 transactions in October. Happy to go into those too, if that's of interest. So.
That's great. So you've got some top talent sitting right next to you. In a minute, I want to ask Bill and Kristina whether they have any advice for the New York Green Bank based upon what you've just heard. But before that, the first question I have actually is, are you hiring students out of graduate school? Because I think you're going to get some resumes if the answer to that is yes.
So we are hiring for the summer. I think we just offered positions to a couple folks on our transaction team, but our operations and strategy team is actively looking. So
great. Then more broadly, there are green banks all over the United States right now, where this kind of emerging move. How would you locate what you're doing within that kind of general green bank movement? Are you learning lessons from other green banks?
Yeah, absolutely. We're so the Connecticut Green Bank was the first green bank in the nation. We're the largest green bank in the country. And we've been working closely, primarily I'd say, with kind of a handful. New Jersey has an energy resiliency bank. Hawaii has their GEMS program. A few other states are really looking into this model. But when we first got started, we relied really heavily on the Connecticut Green Bank, the UK Green Investment Bank, and the Australian Clean Energy Finance Corporation. Those are kind of the most advanced of sort of this type of financing model where you're using public funds and leveraging those with public-private dollars. So yes, we learn a lot from it.
And then you talked about the financial categories. How about the technology categories? Are you doing all renewables?
Yes, so that's a good question. So we have a full list of technologies that we're part of. So as part of this sort of statewide transition, we're a part of what's called the Clean Energy Fund, which is an effort to kind of pool together all of the state spending on clean energy and energy efficiency projects throughout the state. So we're technology risk averse. We can't really invest in innovative technologies. We're really here to drive, again, scale and to advance proven technologies. But so the Clean Energy Fund is working through the technologies that are kind of qualify for their funding, and we're a piece of that. So it's an evolving question.
So Bill, any thoughts or reactions to what you're hearing about the New York Green Bank, or any advice for the bank?
My overly positive assessment of what's happening.
Well, actually, it made me think of another positive experience we had in this country. But in a way, it took off from activities although they were often at the local level, not even at the state level. And then it blossomed in the context of the 1920s. Into a massive increase in generating capacity in the United States. We went from 13 to 33 gigawatts in about 6 years of generating capacity across the United States. Now, it was not done with market discipline and constrained by the partnership with private sectors. Began with state and local governments and a certain kind of entrepreneurial firm that doesn't exist anymore. The firms that were technology leaders in sharing out technological innovation across the industry, companies like ESB, which I think stood for Electrical Storage and something, came out of MIT. And they first took the state-of-the-art technology and educated electric utilities as to how to do it. And then they realized that there was a financing constraint. So they became the sponsors of what initially was a profoundly effective and then became a household curse, the utility holding company. Sam Insull of Chicago. So electric utilities were local. They got to get the returns necessary, the assured returns necessary for capital. They got local monopolies, right? It's like cable. Right. So you might argue their core competence, since it wasn't technological, was how do you get a franchise in a local government? Usually that means how do you know who to bribe? But they're subject to risk. They're subject to the risk that comes from undifferentiated sources of demand and a very capital-intensive project with very low marginal cost. So you can't have competition. This is a, quote, natural monopoly. And to diversify, the holding companies were created. And they became the hottest stocks in the great bull market bubble of the 1920s. From Florida Power and Light to Insull's Chicago-based holding company, highly leveraged, very financially, how shall I say, exciting. And between 1929 and 33, they all went bust. And one of the last major pieces of New Deal legislation was the Public Utility Holding Company Act, which banned them. But what it brings up is that the partner for this kind of state sponsorship, whether it comes through stable subsidies, not on again, off again, or research funding, or procurement, the Defense Department or the government as the lead customer, pulling the industry along. What goes with that is creating the conditions for a productive bubble. And that's how capital gets mobilized at a scale which will never be mobilized by prudent, conservative, market-disciplined projects, which nonetheless are necessary and useful, but I don't think are going to get us the investment to get us to the carbon-free future of 2050 without a bubble.
And broadly speaking, do you think this is a strategy for doing that? The type of,
Well, I think what we need to do, clearly, it's not a technological issue. I entirely agree with Kristina. I think that there's a great deal of grassroots, if you like, support for this at the state and local level. But we have a political block. We have a political blockage. We have a political blockage which, whether it's majority leader lobbying the states to save the coal industry. I think somebody told me last week there are 7,200 coal miners in Kentucky. Until we deal with that, until we deal with this issue of the political national, and I don't, you know far more than I do about what the path is to being able to universalize the green banks and in such a scale that it creates the opportunity, and this is the key, for investors to believe that they can make money whether or not the underlying project succeeds. That's the definition of a productive financial bubble.
Okay.
That's how, by the
Yeah,
way, the dot-com bubble, the big bucks were not about dot-coms. It wasn't about pets.com. The big bucks were laying the fiber in the ground at radically excessive quantities, which was finally lit up 5 to 10 years after it was, and the companies like Global Crossing went bust, but as the great economist Brad DeLong said, now we get to use their stuff, which is just as we had done with the railway manias of the 19th century.
I want to see, Kristina, about any comments you have on the green bank. Then after that, we have about a half an hour left. I want to ask about carbon tax, which we haven't mentioned yet. And then see if you have any quick comments, and then go to the audience, because I'm sure we have a lot of talent in the audience I want to bring into this. So, but any thoughts about the green bank from what you said?
So, first of all, I enjoyed your comments, Sarah, and I guess I just have a question, which is, if you've read the book, The Unwinding, so there's this amazing character in here. I think it's called Red Truck. What's it? Someone read it's like Red Truck or something, biodiesel, and he goes around to all the restaurants and he picks up their oil and he uses it in his fuel and he gives it away to the schools so they can run their school buses, and he's just always running out of money. And so I guess what I'm trying to ask is, why do you need to get market level returns? Because there's so much money out there to invest in infrastructure deals right now that why would, if they're going to make money, why wouldn't they go to, the private sector? Is there a role for having some ability to foster this productive bubble? Because that's what I'm not hearing, is how we get that productive bubble going.
Yeah, that's a very fair question. We hear a lot that there's a lot of money on the sidelines and that there's a lot of money being invested into this space, but we haven't, we don't have solar panels are not on every building in New York, and a significant portion of our energy mix isn't yet coming from renewables, and the investments just haven't been there. And so we're really there to be sort of that bridge to do these first few projects, to try to encourage the private sector to do them on their own, and then that's when we step away.
But I think what you're also saying is that you have to do it this way for political legitimacy, because there isn't this kind of override. You're subject to being hauled up to Albany and queried about whether you're giving the taxpayers or the ratepayers money away, whether there's favoritism and who gets the support. So you have to have, the market discipline is what provides you with political legitimacy. What I'm saying is that what was extraordinary about the 1950s, 60s, 70s and the world of DARPA was that this overriding mission of national security transformed the debate from efficiency, which is what you're dealing with, to effectiveness. Understanding that waste is a necessary collateral of making the kind of transformational investments which are then backed by financial speculators, not prudent investors, when you start getting to scale and showing that it works. But absent that political cover, I totally sympathize with your need to demonstrate the prudence of the conservative, market-disciplined investor. But that's the frustration. That's the frustration.
Yeah, I mean, even 50 basis points would be huge, right? I mean, being in hydropower, I had a chance to go and after my 2-year ethics bar, I was able to go and talk to folks at DOE about, well, why not have a loan guarantee program for hydro projects? So they announced one, which was great, but when I went back, they're only for very large projects, which we won't build large hydro projects in the U.S. except for maybe pump storage. And I'm not advocating that we build the kind of dams we did back in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, but it means that the smaller developer, because of the fees and the uncertainty of getting the loan, they can't afford it. So I actually did a calculation on, what would be the fees and at what size would you be able to be just competitive with a regular bank. And it actually was about $300 million. You'd have to borrow about $300 million. And then, most of the developers are small in the U.S. and they're not at the $300 million. So it'd only be for pump storage. What's the problem with pump storage? There's no market, really. There's not a defined way to get your money back. So, I wish it well, but it missed the mark, unfortunately.
Lots to pursue here. Let me just ask about carbon tax, and then we'll go to the audience. One thing I've heard some in this space is, without a carbon tax, we're never going to get to a clean energy future. That's the fundamental prerequisite. Do you agree with that, disagree with that? What are your thoughts?
I've been in favor of a carbon tax since 1973. But I've also believed that there was an easy trade, and I find it astonishing that not a single political figure or commentator has ever picked up on it. Trade taxing labor for taxing carbon. Trade the Social Security tax, the payroll tax. Now that it's no longer a case of getting everybody with skin in the game, Social Security is safe no matter what. Trade Social Security tax for a carbon tax. Tax the consumption of carbon versus the expenditure of labor. It's not going to happen in my lifetime. I hope it will happen in some of your graduate students' lifetime. But I think that, that is one issue on which almost every economist across the entire spectrum, including the ones that Paul Krugman despises, can agree on. It is the simplest way. I read it not as an economic desideratum, but rather as a signal for when we have, if we get, the political consensus we need.
We were so close. We were so close. You remember?
On the emissions trading program, yes,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah.
The comment that I made about, having been a provost and a dean, it's sort of like the tax that the provost and the president in some universities has on all the departments in order to mass together resources, you can do really big projects, right? So what I enjoyed about your article in Foreign Affairs was that you need the state backing large projects. We need the state to back large infrastructure projects because those are just the projects we all need and use, but none of us can really afford them. Now, I just wonder, and this is a question maybe for Sarah, is crowdfunding a possibility? Do you think we can crowdfund some of these projects? Because if the market won't move, the banks, I would have been happy to get 2 or 3% on my money over the last 5 years, right? So, thoughts on that?
Yeah, so a couple of thoughts. So in regards to crowdfunding, yes, we're actually seeing some really interesting crowdfunding models, some in the wind space, which is really interesting. Cool. So I think yes, and again, the more interest we see in this, the more interest we have in it. So definitely that's been an interesting area to watch. And just going back to your guys' comments on the Green Bank, I think I was speaking to this kind of larger energy evolution here in New York, and one of the things that we're trying to do with Green Bank, and I think the state as a whole, is really to create a market rather than to have the state be the market, as opposed to having the state set the price for certain types of products and to support these one-off projects and technologies. We're here to help enable the market and market forces to drive these further. It's obviously everybody gets better returns when these markets are highly liquid. So, and so just speaking to, again, in terms of pricing our products at market rates, we have some flexibility in terms of like liquidity premiums and things like that. But again, we're really trying to enable the private sector forces to kind of take this and run with it. And I'm all for a carbon tax. That's all I have to say about it.
Please, if you have questions, we have a microphone right here, and we can pass it around as well if that's easier. Got a hand right there and a hand right there. Oh, okay.
You could just line up, state your name and affiliation for people watching.
Hi, my name is Vane Lashawa. I'm an advocate for geothermal energy. And like the President's State of the Union in 2011, geothermal was not mentioned at all.
I know.
All renewables. Now, and one of the things that I say is there is unlimited power within 10 miles of everywhere on Earth, not just in the rivers and not just straight down. And geothermal plants have no virtually few externalities. We don't have to mine, refine, transport, burn, collect the waste, and throw it away. And that's the one problem I think with nuclear. We've got 60 plants a year. Is that what you said? And if you take a geothermal research project like Apollo or put it around something, create on Stewart Field here in New York, drill a hole, find out how to get there. Either mine it, get down to it, and generate the power down there, or start on the surface. Once you've got the footprint of a plant, it's the same for any fossil fuel plant or nuclear plant or whatever, and it's forever. It's not just go out to Colorado, find some uranium and process it. And this is one of the things that the Geothermal Energy Association and Cornell University and MIT have all written great papers on, is how this works. And the only generation technology that betters geothermal in the end is hydro.
Geothermal, I feel your pain. There's a lot of similarities between hydropower and geothermal, and we did actually have geothermal in the STEP plan. I think the challenge is, first of all, love ground source heat pump, love that sort of local, every new building should be putting in a ground source heat pump. It's very competitive, the payback is enormously quick. In terms of just finding the resource, I think the challenge really is, and maybe this is an opportunity for the Green Bank, is finding the sites. And that's where it's a little bit like wildcatting and finding where you drill. And I think that's where a lot of people have the challenge. I think the other challenge, similar to hydro, is people just don't understand it. The bankers and folks, when you go to the bank, they don't understand it. So, as I said, I feel your pain.
Sir.
My name's Carl Kessler. I'm a partner at a IT startup here in the city, and I just follow energy issues, and I thank you very much for your presentation. It was great. And I was at a book signing by Neil deGrasse Tyson, who you might know is the astronomer from TV and everything, and he was talking about why there wasn't, or what motivated investment in things, big projects like space projects, and that you were talking about a national mission. And I'm thinking, he said that basically you can't do these big projects unless you're either afraid, like we were of the Soviets at the time, or there's a tremendous way to make money out of it. And I wonder, when I think of the vast majority of Americans, they're not, I don't think that they're afraid of the environmental issues, because I don't think it hits them. They don't see it. They think, oh, well, there's a tornado. It didn't hit me. But they are afraid of $5 gas. And I think that's, the thing that they can see most clearly. And when you look at advertising by the American Petroleum Institute, they're talking about, fracking has solved the problem of $5 gas. Right. And they have the message. They're leading the messaging right now. And they've captivated, and it's like this is the problem of sustainability. You can look at it two ways, environmental and also supply. And I think they're getting it. I wonder if you have any comments on that messaging and whether or not they should be called out for calling fracking a sustainable solution.
Right. I think you're very much in line with what I've been trying to say here. I will tell you that I'm on my way from New York to Zurich because there's a conference at ETH later this week on what they're calling political and social bubbles. And one of the prime examples is Project Apollo. How in the hell did two presidents manage to mobilize what today would be approaching $1 trillion to go to the moon for no economic return? And it had something to do with fear of the Soviets. They were going to get there first, so what? But this challenge of how do you create national, momentum around a national mission. And in fact, it's not necessarily fear and I think fear is a really powerful motivator. I think you're absolutely right in climate change in this country. But we're really, who was it? There was just somebody in Congress was talking about how American immigrants should have to testify that they believe in American exceptionalism in order to be allowed into the country. Well, in terms of climate change, we are really now the exception in being, in the state of denial that at least at the top we are. So breaking through that,
I wonder if-
and the $5 gas and fracking, I think you're going to find that is a subset of the larger challenge of people being convinced that we have to invest today for tomorrow, or our grandchildren aren't going to.
I would say in terms of strategies, I wonder if it wouldn't be more effective to point at the $5 gas issue. And I think there's an issue with supply there. But, thanks.
My name is Rob Lifflander. I work for a solar yield co. And we've built about 30 megawatts of 1 to 3 megawatt solar projects. So I have two hopefully quick questions. First, I totally agree with you, Mr. Janeway, about the requirement of a national imperative or mission. But I think that I think that people psychologically have difficulty with problems that are very far off and very complex. So, and I think it dovetails with Ms. Johnson's comment about the small amount of money relatively that would be necessary to make progress. So my first question is fairly simply, what you have people like Mitch McConnell who are going to defend 7,200. That's a great stat, by the way. Coal miners in Kentucky. The question is, what is the sort of rational, strategic pitch to America to make this investment, which I've been saying for the last 7 years that I compare it to a fraction of the defense budget, which of course would be a tiny percentage as well. So that's the first question: is what is I think it's a sales question. How do we convince the people who see a huge problem? It's very far off, very complex. Let's worry about it in 20 years. What is the pitch to them? How can we rationalize that? And then the second question is about the disconnect and lack of cohesiveness between state incentive programs and programs to promote clean energy and the federal government. We only invest in projects in a very limited number of states because the federal incentive is just not enough.
The only thing, I'll take the second question, right? So what's the quote? Nations talk and cities act, or that's the thing. That's where I think you're seeing the movement, is at the states and the cities. So I think you're right. I think the disconnect will be there for a little while, but hopefully not too long.
The great Louis Brandeis said the states are the laboratories of democracy, and I think we are in a state, small s, in this country where we are dependent on initiatives at state and local level, and that's where we'll find the political entrepreneurs who can fashion the message and get it sold and get it bought, and then potentially rise to national stature. But I think we really have to go on to the next speaker.
Yeah.
My name's Adam Halbert. I guess I'm a student here, but I've been out for a while. We've bought and sold, I think, a couple solar farms, my family, and I've been building a rail car manufacturing company for maybe 3 years now. So I have an understanding of the midstream and upstream and how they connect, and a certain amount of how to process steel and make it and create items that would service these industries. And you see that there's a large disconnect, especially in North America. You don't see people that understand how things are made. We understand service industry, especially in New York City. We understand how a certain amount of risk-averse financial options, but I would be curious more or less how why the educational aspect of teaching us how to create new technologies that are not standard, and teaching us how to, I guess, approach finding technologies that are not within our repertoire, that come from basic industries such as steel, that are not any longer in the North American world. How we can reapproach that and get back to, I guess, learning how to build things.
Great, thank you. Why don't we get this gentleman?
Timothy Chung from Clearview Energy Partners. What would you say is more important in mobilizing capital right now? Is it a stable tax regime, or is it more of a stable regulatory environment? And to put it another way, PTC versus CPP, do you want both? Is it neither? Which one do you think is more important? Thank you.
All right, got manufacturing and stable regulatory for stable tax. Any comments on that?
Yeah, well, I think there's a great song by a great singer that goes, "Why do I have to choose?" I think the answer is clearly both. And both have to be underwritten by the kind of political consensus we've talked about in order to be stable.
Just quick comment on PTCs versus, say, the ITCs. If it's a low cost of capital like waste energy, you want to get the PTC. If it's a higher cost of capital and more investment like hydro or geothermal, that area, then you definitely want the ITC. So yeah, I think you need both.
On the manufacturing thing, I'd just say two things. One, and this is kind of cultural, I've been a close observer, because I'm on Tim O'Reilly's board, of the maker movement.
Oh, yeah.
And the maker movement is a big deal. And it's with 3D printing now implementing it, the ability to experiment and then have something that can actually be passed on, I think is actually quite fundamental. Distributed, the application of the design technologies that can run on your, they run on your iPad, you don't need a workstation, connecting to 3D printing. And on the other hand, I'm sure there's something at Columbia, I happen to know the program at MIT that Liz Reynolds runs, on manufacturing and some real analysis of what kind of manufacturing has actually come back to the United States in the last 10 years. I take a look at the MIT Center. It's a center, you'll find the word manufacturing in it, and it might cheer you up a little bit.
All right, I really want to bring you all in. I promised one of our speakers, who will remain unnamed, but whose wife's birthday is today, that I would get him out on time. And the last thing I want to do is get in trouble with his wife and him. Therefore, we are going to end promptly at 6:30. And so why don't we take each of we got 4 people in line. It's great. If you make your comments quick, please, and then we'll get a final round from our panelists. So thank you.
Hi, thank you very much for a very interesting panel. My name is Rebecca Dell. I work for the Department of Energy, but of course I'm not speaking on behalf of the Department of Energy today. And the question I wanted to ask was about the role of incumbents, which Mr. Janeway and some of the other speakers touched on. And one of the things that was a very interesting and hopeful development for me in the last couple of years was the proposition in California to overturn their Global Warming Solutions Act, which failed after the clean energy industry expended many times more money than the fossil fuel industry did in lobbying the people of California. And so this was a situation in which, at least in one state, admittedly a state with a very large clean energy sector, there was clearly a financial interest in maintaining supports for being aggressive on clean energy. And whether this is something that we can learn from, or what can we learn from this, and and can we apply this? How can we see this model propagating across the United States and used at the national level?
Terrific, thank you, sir.
I'm AJ Goulding. In addition to teaching electricity markets here, as some of you know, I'm the president of Ampersand Hydro, as well as the president of London Economics International. The main question that I would have for all of you is, I'm concerned that what we have right now are a set of policies that are essentially attempting to pick winners rather than seeking least cost, technology neutral solutions to global warming. And I worry that while I hear all of you having great faith in large projects and a belief in market failure, I'm concerned that we will end up with potentially uneconomic non-solutions to the problem. So I'll be interested to hear your comments. Thank you.
Hi, Daniel Goldman. I work for a tech and biotech investor. Thank you very much for a terrific discussion. So with regards to Dr. Janeway's comment apropos of national security interests, there already are a number of countries for whom this is a matter of national security, whether because their environmental conditions leave them most vulnerable to these geographic and environmental effects, such as Vietnam or the Netherlands, or because the majority of their exports are fossil fuels, which are likely to run out in the near future and will leave their economy in shambles if nothing is done about it in the near future. And in addition, the IMF has estimated that $1.9 trillion are being spent annually in fossil fuel subsidies globally, which massively distorts the potential market for renewables. So why don't the major multilateral institutions, the international development banks and the national development banks, sponsor a program whereby they provide incentives to countries that are providing fossil fuel subsidies to their citizens in the form of preferential loans, grants, whatever it might be, that can be on the condition that this financing can be directed towards renewable energy of all stripes, ranging from basic science and R&D to distributed solar to hydro, thereby providing the proper incentives for these countries to get out in front of their problems and solve this global issue.
Thank you very much. Last but not least.
Thank you for this talk. And so I'm Leo Lemardant. I'm a PhD candidate at Columbia University Engineering School. And I'm a former hydropower engineer. And I am also a co-founder of a French crowdfunding platform in France, dedicated to...
Can I get your card?
No. Yeah, sure. Dedicated to renewable energy projects. So, and my question is, as a European, how you, American, see the carbon trading scheme and as an option that could be that could replace the carbon tax?
We have 4 tremendous and provocative and interesting questions, and not nearly enough time to do them justice, so our apologies for that. But why don't we, in our remaining few minutes, just go down the line this way, and we'll start with Sarah, and then go to Kristina, and then Bill can have the last word. And I heard questions on California and the success of the clean energy entrepreneurs there and winning the referendum battle, on policies that pick winners and whether that's a bad strategy, on new MDB programs, and on how we Americans look at emissions trading. And I'm sure I missed a few threads there in that quick summary, but anything that anything you want to pick up on there, and then any closing comments, Sarah?
Yeah, and I'll be brief. I know we're on a tight deadline. I'm going to focus on the policy picking winners question. I mean, I think everything that we're trying to accomplish in New York right now is really speaking to this idea of using government, sort of having government step out of the way of picking winners and losers, and really letting the market do that, as they're obviously, you know, it's market forces that are going to determine what are the right technologies and what are the right type of financing structures, and what's the best way to kind of encourage this low carbon economy to unfold. The government's done a really good job of sort of setting up the infrastructure for distributed solutions, but I mean, it seems like now's the time to really let the private sector take over. So we're trying to facilitate that in a comprehensive and really regulated way. I mean, that's the whole purpose of REV, is to work with our utilities to encourage them to think about a different type of business model that's going to help address some of the capacity issues that we have in New York and across the country. One other piece of that is really driving really thinking about how we're driving consumer demand. So I think this analogy is made pretty frequently about how the internet boom is very similar to what's happening in the clean energy space right now. And I heard Richard Kaufman's chief of staff, Kate Burson, say this at an event a couple weeks ago, and I thought this made a lot of sense, that the solutions we're thinking of are almost more like an Uber as opposed to like an internet. You know, it's energy solutions that are going to fit your budget and your style, and you can decide whether or not you want that app that's going to let you, operate your Nest from home or not. So I think it's a very exciting time, and maybe overly optimistic, but I'm young, so I'm allowed to be.
Great.
Just a couple questions. So there is the Millennium Corporation that funded $300 million in Malawi to do hydropower there. So I think that's an opportunity to access. The U.S. is putting money out there. OPIC, which is the Overseas Private Investment Corporation, also funds a lot of energy development in IMF. So I do think the country is doing that. We may in the future go international, but right now I just got to kind of get our act together in North America.
I'm just going to address the two that I know something about, the incumbents and the picking winners question. With respect to incumbents, what we saw in California was a micro example of exactly what DARPA orchestrated back in the 1970s and 80s. I told the story about AT&T fighting packet switching and the deployment of DARPANet, which was the predecessor to the internet. And what DARPA did with great political nous was to mobilize and develop a community that was able to operate effectively more inside the Beltway than across the country. So there is a need for that kind of political entrepreneurship and community building here that I think is absolutely essential. Second, with respect to picking winners, I myself was not enamored of the loan guarantee program, but back in that golden age of IT, first of all, with the Defense Department, all the elements of it, not just DARPA, they insisted and enforced a radically open intellectual property regime. They required that anybody who got research dollars from the government licensed on a fair and non-discriminatory basis their patents to anyone, including their most bitter competitors. If the stuff they were doing really mattered and the government was a customer, they required that the vendor, the supplier, put a competitor into direct competition as a second source in case the primary source. So what that did in the course of 20 years was create a reservoir of accessible technology for the next generation of entrepreneurs and the venture guys who backed them to build the computer industry that in turn became the internet industry of tomorrow. So I couldn't agree more. We had the enormous advantage versus the Europeans, who in France, Britain, and Germany all picked national champions in computing, all of which failed. And it was precisely, but by the way, it wasn't a market solution. It was not the market that decided that silicon was better than germanium. It was the empowered program managers in DARPA who drove IBM to have to do a deal with a startup called Texas Instruments to get access to the silicon technology that DARPA had supported and brought the industry along. If the market had been allowed to rule without that kind of guidance and leadership, we probably would have lost 10 to 20 years in bringing computing to the commercial market.
Bill, Kristina, Sarah, from the Center on Global Energy Policy, thank you so much. Would you please join me in giving them a big hand?